History is rarely born in grand halls, beneath banners, or under the glare of ceremony. More often, it grows quietly, through ordinary lives, forgotten struggles, and choices made by people who never imagined the future would remember them. Tonight, we travel into the long unfolding story of a nation that did not begin as a nation at all. Before the flags, before the borders, before the words, United States, were ever spoken, there was only land. Ancient, unclaimed by maps, and rich with stories long before anyone called it America. What we now know as a country once existed as a continent of forests, rivers, and skies. It was shaped by migrations, cultures, and civilizations that understood the land in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. Their world did not appear suddenly, it evolved slowly, like a river carving its way through stone. This journey is not just about wars and treaties, nor only about presidents and revolutions. It is about the deeper fabric of history, the quiet forces that formed a society, the conflicts that remade it, and the ideas that changed the world. If you enjoy true history told with honesty and depth, welcome to the channel. Make yourself comfortable, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more long-form historical storytelling. Now allow the noise of the day to fade. Let curiosity take its place. And together, let us begin at the beginning, long before anyone imagined a nation would rise here at all. Before colonists, before kingdoms raised their banners, and long before Europe learned the shape of the Atlantic, the continent that would become America existed in a state of quiet balance. To understand its future, we must first honor its past. 12,000 years ago, the world was colder. Vast sheets of ice stretched across the northern hemisphere, and oceans stood lower than they do today. From Siberia to Alaska, a corridor of frozen land created a bridge between worlds, a pathway traveled not by conquerors or empires, but by families searching for food, safety, and possibility. They crossed slowly, generation after generation, following the movements of bison and mammoth, unaware that their footsteps were writing the opening chapters of a story that would endure for millennia. These early migrants did not settle in a single place. They moved outward like rivers branching toward the sea. Some followed the Great Plains into the heart of the continent, where grasses swayed endlessly beneath the wind. Others moved south into deserts, adapting to heat and scarcity with remarkable ingenuity. Still others turned east, into dense forests thick with game and shelter. What emerged over time was not a single civilization, but thousands of distinct cultures, each shaped by the land it inhabited and the lessons of generations before. They built homes, languages, trade networks, and stories. Some created pottery, others carved tools, and others traced constellations across the night sky. To them, the land was not a possession, but a relationship. It gave food, shelter, and guidance, and in return demanded respect. If we imagine this world not through the lens of modern borders, but as it existed then, we find a continent teeming with life and complexity. Along the Mississippi River Valley rose a city historians now call Cahokia, a settlement larger than London in its own age. Earthen mounds rose like pyramids toward the sky, serving as platforms for ceremonies, leaders, and worship. From the highest mound, the horizon must have stretched endlessly, revealing not only farmland but the promise of a civilization quietly thriving. Far to the southwest, in the lands of sandstone and desert, communities learned to bend the environment to their will. They carved homes into cliffs, creating villages that seemed to hang suspended between earth and sky. Their architecture was not merely functional, it was symbolic, linking the living to the ancient spirits of their ancestors. With irrigation channels and dry farming techniques, they coaxed life from soil that most would consider barren. Along the Pacific coast, forests of cedar and rivers rich with salmon sustained vibrant cultures whose heritage survives in intricate totems and oral traditions. These totems were not decorations. They were libraries carved in wood. Histories of clans, legends, victories, and warnings preserved for generations. Across the plains, where vast herds of bison migrated seasonally, life followed the rhythm of the animals. Every part of the bison served a purpose: meat for nourishment, hides for shelter, bones for tools. Waste was unthinkable, for survival depended on balance. It is tempting to imagine pre-colonial America as a peaceful paradise, untouched and harmonious. But reality was more nuanced. These societies traded, negotiated, competed, and sometimes fought. Alliances rose and fell. Stories of war existed beside stories of marriage and peace. In other words, they were human, with all the complexity humanity brings. Yet despite their differences, one idea remained constant: the land was sacred. Rivers were arteries, mountains were guardians, and animals were teachers. Life did not separate the physical from the spiritual, it embraced them as one. This worldview would soon collide with another, a worldview that saw land not as heritage but as property, and people not as nations but as obstacles. For now, however, we remain in the age before contact, when the American continent existed in its fullness, unmeasured by maps and unnamed by foreign tongues. But across the ocean, change was stirring. Empires dreamed of expansion, monarchs hungered for wealth, and sailors prepared to gamble their lives on the unknown. Soon, ships would cross the Atlantic, and nothing would ever be the same again. Across the Atlantic, the world was changing. Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries was a continent in restless transition. Old empires strained beneath new ambitions, monarchs measured prestige by territory, and merchants dreamed of trade routes that would bring them fortune. Science was stirring, navigation was improving, and the boundaries of the known world felt both insufficient and full of possibility. Yet even amid this curiosity and hunger, the shape of the world remained largely mysterious. Maps of the era were beautiful but flawed, filled with speculation and myth. Sea monsters lurked on the page, continents bent in impossible ways, and distant lands were annotated with hopeful guesses. In port cities, rumors of uncharted waters and islands rich in spices circulated endlessly, carried by sailors returning from long and perilous voyages. It was not pure curiosity that drove Europe toward exploration, it was competition. Spain, Portugal, France, and England each vied to outmaneuver the others, to secure wealth and glory, and to expand influence beyond their borders. The seas became a new battlefield, not of armies but of ambition. Portugal was among the first to look beyond the horizon. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese sailors learned to follow the African coastline, mapping it inch by inch. They traded, negotiated, and sometimes conquered, searching for gold, spices, and access to eastern markets. Their caravels, fast and agile, sliced through waters previously feared by most European mariners. Step by step, their explorations pushed the known world outward. Spain, watching from across the Iberian Peninsula, was equally eager. As the Reconquista drew to an end and the Spanish kingdoms unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, the nation found itself poised for expansion. Spain's attention shifted from the land to the sea, and the sea in turn pointed toward opportunity. Into this environment stepped a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who believed that by sailing westward he could reach the riches of Asia more swiftly than by rounding Africa. Scholars debated his calculations, many doubted his vision. But Europe's great transformations often began not with certainty, but with persistence. Columbus presented his plans to courts across the continent. Most refused him. At last, Spain agreed. In 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 ships and an idea that would reshape continents. His voyage was not the first crossing of the Atlantic, others had traveled farther and earlier, but his arrival triggered a chain of events that would alter history on both sides of the ocean. When he reached the Caribbean, he believed for the rest of his life that he stood on the edge of Asia. In truth, he had encountered something far different. A land rich with civilizations unfamiliar to Europe and a world Europe would soon covet. Columbus's return to Spain was triumphant, and the news of his discovery spread swiftly. Within months, Spain prepared additional expeditions. Other nations took notice. A new era began, one of exploration, conquest, and exchange, filled with promise for some and tragedy for others. For the peoples of the Americas, the arrival of Europeans marked the beginning of a profound collision. Europeans brought metal tools, firearms, and horses, technologies unfamiliar to many native societies. They also brought diseases, silent and invisible, that would prove devastating. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread faster than any army could march, carving through communities with terrifying speed. In some regions, entire villages fell silent within weeks, leaving only memories and abandoned hearths. Yet to say this collision was one-sided would be to oversimplify. The exchange ran both ways. Crops such as maize, potatoes, and tomatoes traveled across the Atlantic to Europe, reshaping diets and economies. The potato, in particular, would become a staple so important that centuries later, its absence would spark famine. The tomato, once feared as poisonous, would transform cuisines in Italy and beyond. This movement of plants, animals, ideas, and diseases came to be known as the Columbian Exchange. A vast biological and cultural transformation that forever linked the Old World and the New. Horses, cattle, pigs, wheat, and technologies flowed westward, foods, medicines, and agricultural innovations flowed east. The world became more connected, more interdependent, and more complex. Meanwhile, European powers raced to stake claims. Spain moved quickly, sending explorers, missionaries, and soldiers into the Caribbean and mainland. Conquistadors sought gold and glory, reshaping societies through violence, alliances, and conversion. Entire empires, from the Aztec to the Inca, faced invasion and upheaval as Spanish forces combined military strength with disease and political exploitation. Further north, France pursued a different strategy. Drawn less by gold than by fur, French traders formed partnerships with indigenous nations, establishing commercial relationships rooted in negotiation rather than conquest. They learned local languages, intermarried, and built networks that extended deep into the interior of the continent. While not free from conflict, these relationships contrasted sharply with the strategies of Spain. England, delayed by domestic turmoil and political shifts, entered the race later. Early attempts at colonization, such as the settlement at Roanoke, vanished into mystery. Yet the idea of an English foothold in the New World persisted, fueled by dreams of profit and rivalries with Spain. When English ships finally arrived to establish permanent colonies, they brought with them a vision of society grounded not only in commerce, but in settlement, families, farms, and towns. As the 17th century unfolded, these different models of colonial ambition began to shape the map of North America. Spanish influence dominated the South and West, French interests stretched across the interior, and English colonies clung to the Atlantic coastline. Between and within these territories lived countless indigenous nations, each navigating the new pressures of diplomacy, trade, displacement, and war. To understand this period fully, one must resist the temptation to divide it into simple categories of winners and losers. It was a period of adaptation and resilience, as well as loss and transformation. Some indigenous nations formed strategic alliances, using European rivalries to their advantage. Others retreated into new territories, shifting their agricultural or hunting patterns. Still others fought, defending lands and traditions against incursions they recognized as existential threats. While Europe imagined the New World as a blank canvas awaiting ownership, the peoples who already lived there saw something far different, a disruption of balance, an intrusion into ancient relationships with land and spirit. And yet, amid the collision, new societies began to form, societies neither entirely European nor entirely indigenous, but something more complex. By the early 1600s, a new chapter was beginning. Ships arrived not only with explorers, but with settlers. These settlers brought families, hopes, implements for farming, and dreams of new beginnings. They also brought ideas about governance, property, and religion, ideas that would soon take root in the soil of a land still largely unknown to them. The era of exploration was ending. The era of colonization was about to begin. But what does it mean to build a society from nothing? What happens when belief, desperation, and ambition meet a land they do not yet understand? Those questions would define the next century, as colonies took shape along the Atlantic coast and a new American identity began, quietly, to form. The 17th and early 18th centuries marked a transformation not only of territory, but of identity. The English colonies that lined the Atlantic coast did not appear suddenly, nor did they immediately imagine themselves as a future nation. They began as experiments, fragile ventures of commerce, religion, survival, and ambition. Each settlement carried a different purpose, and from those purposes would emerge the tensions that would eventually reshape the world. The first permanent English colony in North America was established at Jamestown in 1607, in the marshlands of Virginia. Its early years were marked not by triumph, but by hunger, disease, and desperation. The settlers arrived expecting gold and profit. Instead, they confronted a land they did not understand and a climate that punished their assumptions. Many starved, and many died. Those who survived did so only through adaptation and extraordinary resilience. Over time, tobacco became the lifeblood of Virginia, fueling a labor system that would leave deep and lasting consequences. Further north, in New England, the story unfolded differently. Puritans seeking religious refuge crossed the Atlantic to establish communities grounded in faith, discipline, and shared purpose. Their settlements, such as Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, prioritized collective responsibility and education, believing that literacy was essential for reading scripture. Towns grew around meeting houses, and laws reflected the stern morality of their beliefs. While the terrain was colder and less fertile than the southern colonies, the New Englanders built enduring societies rooted in family, church, and trade. Between these worlds lay the middle colonies. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, culturally diverse and economically flexible. Here, Dutch, English, German, Scandinavian, and other settlers mingled, exchanging languages, customs, and ideas. Quakers in Pennsylvania promoted tolerance and pacifism, challenging the rigid hierarchies found elsewhere. Cities such as Philadelphia and New York emerged as centers of commerce, thought, and innovation, linking the colonies to markets across the Atlantic. Yet even as these societies took shape, they remained tied to Britain, politically, economically, and culturally. Colonists read British newspapers, debated British philosophers, drank British tea, and governed themselves under charters granted by the Crown. London saw the colonies as valuable extensions of its power, sources of raw materials and consumers of manufactured goods. For decades, this arrangement functioned with a kind of uneasy harmony. But harmony has a way of concealing tension, and beneath the surface, tension was indeed growing. Colonists developed their own assemblies, town meetings, and local systems of governance. Decisions that once required a distant authority were increasingly made by those who lived with their consequences. This experience nurtured a sense of autonomy, and with autonomy came expectation. Britain, meanwhile, wrestled with its own realities. Empires are expensive to maintain, and war against rival European powers drained its treasury. The mid-18th century brought the 7 Years' War, a conflict that stretched from Europe to Asia to the Americas. In North America, it was known as the French and Indian War, a struggle for control of territory and influence that pitted Britain against France, each with indigenous allies who fought for their own interests. When the war ended, Britain triumphed, and France ceded vast lands. For the colonies, this victory opened new frontiers. For Britain, it opened new debts. It was at this moment, when the empire expanded and the treasury strained, that the seeds of revolution were sown. Britain believed the colonies should help pay for the war that had, in London's view, protected them. Colonists believed that taxation without representation violated the rights they understood as Englishmen. The issue was not merely financial, but philosophical. What did it mean to be part of an empire? What were the limits of authority? Who had the right to govern? Taxes such as the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and Townshend Acts ignited debates that spread from taverns to assemblies to newspapers. Pamphlets questioned the legitimacy of Parliament's decisions. Boycotts emerged. Protests grew. What Britain regarded as administrative policy, the colonies experienced as intrusion. Yet rebellion was not inevitable. Many colonists remained loyal, and many sought only compromise. But history often advances not through moderation, but through escalation. Escalation arrived in Boston, a port city that became a crucible of unrest. The presence of British troops in its streets fed suspicion and resentment. On a cold March evening in 1770, tensions boiled over. Snowballs, insults, and fear led to musket fire. 5 colonists fell. The event would be named the Boston Massacre, and though modest in casualties, its impact was immense. Images and narratives spread quickly, stirring emotion and shaping opinion. 3 years later, anger took a more dramatic form. In protest of the Tea Act, colonists disguised themselves and boarded ships in Boston Harbor, dumping crates of British tea into the water. The gesture was symbolic and defiant. Britain responded with laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, designed to punish Massachusetts and reassert authority. Instead, they strengthened unity among the colonies. Delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia in 1774 for the First Continental Congress, not to declare independence, but to deliberate, petition, and seek redress. Yet dialogue with Britain grew strained, and mistrust deepened. The following spring, in Lexington and Concord, the first shots of war were fired. The revolution had begun, not with declarations and speeches, but with gunpowder and uncertainty. The Second Continental Congress convened soon after, appointing a commander to lead the Continental Army, George Washington. Tall, reserved, and respected, he embodied the gravity of the moment. His task was difficult. He faced the most powerful military in the world with a force untested, underfunded, and often ill-equipped. Even then, independence was not immediate. Many hoped for reconciliation. But the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in early 1776 changed the conversation. Written in plain language for ordinary people, the pamphlet argued not for compromise, but for freedom. Why, it asked, should an island rule a continent? Why should monarchy, a system inherited by accident of birth, dictate the lives of men who believed themselves capable of self-government? By summer, sentiment shifted. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, a document that proclaimed ideals far ahead of their time. It asserted that all men are created equal, that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that the people may alter or abolish a government that fails its purpose. The document was aspirational, imperfect, and profound. Its principles would challenge the very society that produced it. Independence, however, was not victory. Britain rejected the declaration as treason and prepared for war on a scale the colonies could scarcely imagine. The conflict that followed would test endurance, diplomacy, and the meaning of liberty itself. As armies marched, alliances formed. France, motivated as much by rivalry with Britain as by sympathy for the American cause, entered the war after the American victory at Saratoga in 1777. Supplies, officers, and ships crossed the Atlantic, tipping the balance of power. The war expanded, becoming part of a global struggle in which the fate of the colonies was only one theater. The revolution was both political and personal. Soldiers suffered through bitter winters, farmers struggled with inflation, and families lived with uncertainty. Victory was never guaranteed. Yet the idea of independence sustained them, a belief that a new kind of society was possible, one without monarchs, aristocracy, or inherited privilege. In 1781, at Yorktown, the war reached its decisive moment. Surrounded by American and French forces, and with no hope of relief, British General Cornwallis surrendered. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States. But war, even victorious, leaves behind questions unresolved. The colonies had broken from empire. Now they faced a new challenge. How does a nation govern itself? Winning independence was only the beginning. The harder task was building a country, one without kings, without precedent, and without certainty. Part 4 follows the birth of a republic, the experiments of early governance, and the fragile beginning of what would become the United States. Independence had been declared, won, and recognized. Yet the moment the last British ship left American shores, the young nation found itself in an unfamiliar silence. The silence that follows triumph, when celebration fades and responsibility takes its place. For years, the colonies had been united by necessity, bound together by a common enemy. Now they had to bind themselves voluntarily, not against something, but toward something. It was a task more challenging than war. The Articles of Confederation, drafted during the Revolution, had been designed for a nation still learning to speak in plural. The states, cautious of centralized power, granted Congress authority but not the strength to enforce it. There was no executive office, no federal court system, and no reliable means of taxation. Each state coined its own money, set its own trade policies, and guarded its own interests. Though united in name, they operated often as 13 separate countries. At first, the arrangement seemed tolerable. The war was over, and the relief of peace softened concerns about practicality. But peace did not erase debt. The revolution had been costly. Soldiers expected pay, foreign allies expected repayment, and domestic commerce required stability. Without a central authority to regulate trade or currency, economic disputes arose between states, and inflation gnawed at everyday life. Then came Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, a protest not of ideology, but of hardship. Farmers burdened by taxes and debt rose in revolt, blocking courts and challenging the authority of the state. The uprising was suppressed, but its significance was unmistakable. If the government could not maintain order in peace, how could it survive in crisis? The rebellion whispered a truth many had suspected: independence alone did not create unity. In response, leaders gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to revise the Articles. What began as a modest mission soon transformed into an audacious undertaking. The delegates concluded that reform was insufficient, what the nation required was reinvention. Over months of heated debate, compromise, and philosophical struggle, they drafted a constitution unlike any that existed in the world at the time. It established 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, each intended to balance and restrain the others. It granted power, but also imposed limits. The compromises within the document revealed the tensions of the age. Questions of representation, taxation, and federal authority required difficult negotiation. The matter of slavery cast a long shadow. Southern states insisted that their enslaved population be counted for representation, northern states objected. The resulting 3/5 compromise, grim and deeply flawed, was a reminder that the ideals proclaimed in the Declaration awaited a future reckoning. The Constitution was signed not as a perfect blueprint, but as a framework sturdy enough to withstand time and conflict. Ratification was not immediate. Fierce debate erupted between Federalists, who supported the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists, who feared it concentrated power dangerously. Newspapers, pamphlets, and taverns became battlegrounds of persuasion. The Federalist Papers, essays authored by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, argued for the practical and philosophical necessity of the new system. Meanwhile, opponents demanded assurances that individual rights would be protected. From this came the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments designed to safeguard freedoms such as speech, assembly, religion, and due process. In 1789, the Constitution took effect. The United States, still small in population, still fragile in unity, finally had a government designed not in reaction to monarchy, but in pursuit of self-rule. The question then arose, who would lead it? To nearly all, the answer was obvious. George Washington, the general who had endured war with patience and restraint, was unanimously elected as the nation's first president. His acceptance of the office was reluctant, not out of ambition but duty. He understood that every decision he made, no matter how small, would establish precedent. The presidency was not merely a role, it was a template for the future. There was no capital yet. Washington took office in New York and later governed from Philadelphia. The White House had not been built, and the rituals of governance were still unformed. Should the president be addressed formally, like royalty, or casually, like a citizen? Should he serve for life or for a limited term? Should he influence legislation or remain detached? With each choice, Washington defined the boundaries of power. He surrounded himself with capable and contrasting minds. Thomas Jefferson became Secretary of State, advocating for a rural nation built on agriculture, local authority, and individual liberty. Alexander Hamilton, appointed Secretary of the Treasury, envisioned an industrial, commercially ambitious republic empowered by a strong central government. Their rivalry was not merely personal, it reflected competing visions for America's future. Washington mediated their disputes with the calm of a man who had seen war and understood that conflict need not become catastrophe. Hamilton's financial plan sought to stabilize the young nation. He proposed assuming state debts, establishing a national bank, and promoting manufacturing. Jefferson opposed many of these measures, fearing they would favor elites and undermine agrarian independence. Yet compromise prevailed, as it so often would in the young republic. The capital would be relocated to the banks of the Potomac, a gesture to Southern interests, and the national bank would proceed. Washington's presidency also confronted foreign challenges. Europe was once again aflame with revolution, and France, inspired in part by American ideals, erupted in conflict. As monarchies trembled and crowds demanded liberty, Americans debated whether to support their former ally. Washington chose neutrality, wary of entangling a fragile nation in Europe's wars. His decision was criticized by some, praised by others, and ultimately remembered as an act of prudence. Domestic conflict soon followed. Attacks on whiskey sparked rebellion among Western farmers who viewed it as an unfair burden. Washington responded not with words but with action, leading troops to quell the uprising. The message was clear: the federal government possessed both authority and resolve. Law was not merely written, it would be enforced. After 2 terms, Washington declined a third. His retirement set a precedent unbroken until the 20th century. In his farewell address, he warned against political parties, sectionalism, and foreign entanglement, concerns that would echo throughout the nation's history. When he returned to Mount Vernon, he left behind not just a presidency, but a model for leadership defined by humility rather than power. John Adams succeeded him, inheriting a nation that was stable in structure but unsettled in spirit. Political divisions sharpened. Adams struggled with foreign tensions, particularly with France, whose naval forces clashed with American ships. He also signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which restricted speech and targeted immigrants in the name of national security. Critics saw these acts as an overreach, a violation of the liberties the Revolution had claimed to defend. The election of 1800 brought a peaceful transfer of power, a rarity in history, and a triumph for the Republic. Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency, marking the first time political rivals exchanged authority without violence. The world took notice. Experiments in self-government often fail, this one endured. Jefferson sought to simplify government, reduce debt, and expand opportunity. His vision was optimistic, rooted in the belief that a republic of independent farmers would sustain both virtue and stability. Yet he also recognized opportunity when it presented itself. In 1803, Napoleon offered to sell the Louisiana Territory. Jefferson hesitated. The Constitution did not explicitly grant the authority to purchase land, but the chance to double the nation's size could not be ignored. The Louisiana Purchase transformed the map and broadened the horizon of America's future. To explore the new territory, Jefferson commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their expedition mapped rivers, encountered indigenous nations, documented wildlife, and revealed the scale of a continent that extended far beyond imagination. Their journey did not conquer the West, it simply acknowledged its existence. But expansion brought dilemmas as well as possibility. As new lands opened, so too did questions about slavery, sovereignty, and the balance between federal and state authority. The Union was growing, but it was also stretching. By the early 19th century, the United States had achieved what many deemed impossible: it had survived its birth. It had established laws, elected leaders, transferred power peacefully, expanded its territory, and maintained democracy through conflict and debate. Yet even as confidence blossomed, contradictions persisted. A nation founded on liberty permitted slavery. A republic born of unity struggled with division. An experiment in democracy was tested not only by its enemies, but by itself. It was clear that revolution had created a country. Now the country had to create its future. But a nation's future is never linear. Expansion would bring prosperity, conflict, migration, invention, and displacement. In Part 5, the young republic confronts the pressures of growth, the tensions of identity, and the early storms of division. The United States entered the 19th century with a newfound confidence. It had survived war, constructed a government from ideas rather than inheritance, and doubled its territory through a purchase that astonished Europe. Yet confidence is not certainty, and beneath the optimism lay questions no constitution could immediately answer. What did it mean to be American? How far should the nation expand? And could unity survive the tensions growth would produce? The Louisiana Purchase shifted the nation's imagination westward. Maps no longer confined the republic to the narrow strip of land along the Atlantic. Instead, they unfurled into plains, mountains, and rivers that stretched toward horizons few settlers had seen. The continent seemed vast enough to contain limitless possibility, and with possibility came movement. Families loaded wagons, sold possessions, and set forth in search of land. Some sought fertile soil, others sought trade, others pursued the simple hope of a better life. Migration is never purely economic or political, it is emotional. It reflects dissatisfaction with the present and faith in the future, even when the future is unknown. Yet the land settlers saw as new was not uninhabited. Indigenous nations had lived in those regions for centuries, cultivating fields, hunting game, and building communities. To them, the arrival of settlers was not opportunity, but intrusion. Treaties were signed, broken, rewritten, and broken again. Diplomacy was attempted, but diplomacy without balance of power is negotiation in name only. As settlers expanded west, the work of defining American identity accelerated in the east. Commerce grew. Roads and canals linked towns. The economy diversified. New England's mills hummed with industrial energy, weaving textiles from southern cotton. The South, rich in soil and climate, expanded its plantations and deepened its reliance on enslaved labor. The North and South advanced together, yet along paths destined to diverge. The War of 1812 tested the young nation's resolve once more. Britain, still locked in conflict with Napoleon, interfered with American trade and seized sailors for service in its navy. When diplomacy failed, Congress declared war. The conflict was messy and inconclusive. The United States invaded Canada unsuccessfully, while British forces burned Washington, setting fire to the Capitol and the President's residence. Yet despite setbacks, the war fostered resilience. American forces defended Baltimore, and the bombardment of Fort McHenry inspired verses that would become the national anthem. When Andrew Jackson's troops triumphed at New Orleans. Ironically, after the peace treaty had already been signed, the nation celebrated. The war settled few disputes, but it strengthened national pride. With the war concluded, the the so-called era of good feelings, emerged under President James Monroe. For a brief moment, optimism overshadowed division. The economy expanded, infrastructure improved, and political unity seemed possible. But unity built on prosperity often reveals its cracks only with time. Territorial expansion intensified the question of slavery. As new territories sought admission as states, Congress faced the dilemma: should slavery expand westward, or remain confined to older states? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, drawing a line across the Louisiana Territory to limit future expansion of slavery. The compromise quieted debate but did not resolve it. Compromises postpone conflict, they do not eliminate it. During these same years, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall asserted the strength of the federal government. Decisions such as McCulloch v. Maryland affirmed federal authority over state interference, while others shaped the boundaries of commerce and property. The judiciary, often overlooked, became a pillar of the republic's structure, steady, deliberate, and interpretive. As institutions matured, politics democratized. Property requirements for voting diminished, allowing more white men to participate. Newspapers proliferated, fueling debate and shaping opinion. Political parties sharpened their distinctions. The election of 1824, resolved not by voters but by the House of Representatives, stirred accusations of corruption and intensified rivalries. Andrew Jackson, denied the presidency once, won it in 1828 with overwhelming popular support. Jackson's presidency reflected the rise of the common man in American politics. His image was one of frontier toughness, defiance, and populist energy. He distrusted entrenched power and vetoed the renewal of the national bank, denouncing it as a tool of elites. Many celebrated his assertiveness, others feared it. Democracy was expanding, but expansion sometimes came at the expense of restraint. Jackson's policies also brought grave consequences for indigenous peoples. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the displacement of tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast. Despite legal victories such as Worcester v. Georgia, which recognized tribal sovereignty, removal proceeded. Thousands of Cherokee, Muskogee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people were forced westward. The Trail of Tears left a scar on the landscape and on the conscience of the nation. Expansion, for some, meant opportunity, for others, dispossession and loss. While the East struggled with politics and reform, the West continued to beckon. Trails cut into the plains carried settlers toward Oregon, California, and New Mexico territory. The journey was arduous. Disease, weather, starvation, and isolation tested every traveler. Yet the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the nation was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, took hold. Destiny is a powerful force, not because it is true, but because people believe it to be. The annexation of Texas and the war with Mexico in the 1840s added vast lands to the United States. At its conclusion, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded territories that would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of Colorado and New Mexico. The West itself transformed from abstraction to geography. Gold was discovered in California in 1848, igniting a rush that sent thousands across the continent. Towns rose overnight, fortunes were made and lost. And the character of the region changed irrevocably. Immigration surged during these same decades. Waves of Irish and German immigrants arrived, fleeing famine, political upheaval, and economic hardship. They brought new customs, languages, and skills, enriching cities while also provoking nativist backlash. The United States was no longer a society of British origin alone, it was becoming a mosaic of cultures bound not by heritage, but by aspiration. The nation's cultural and intellectual life matured as well. Writers, reformers, educators, and activists questioned the meaning of freedom. Abolitionists challenged slavery not merely as a political issue, but as a moral crisis. Women advocated for greater rights, recognizing that liberty proclaimed in principle must eventually be extended in practice. Reform movements pressed for temperance, education, and humane treatment of the vulnerable. Not all succeeded, but all reflected the dynamic energy of a society still defining its ideals. By the mid-19th century, the United States had undergone a profound transformation. Its population multiplied. Its territory expanded to oceans. Its economy shifted from local to national. Its politics became more participatory, more contentious, and more divided. The idea of America, once modest and experimental, now carried global implications. Yet for all its achievements, unity remained fragile. The nation had never fully resolved the contradiction between freedom and slavery, between federal authority and state autonomy, between expansion and the rights of those displaced by it. These contradictions had been postponed by compromise, softened by optimism, and disguised by prosperity. But contradictions have a way of resurfacing, particularly when pressed by events that refuse to be ignored. The nation had been born through revolution. Soon, it would be tested by something far darker. A conflict not against a foreign empire, but within itself. The United States confronts the gathering storm, political breakdown, sectional division, and the road to civil war. A nation built on ideals now faces the challenge of living up to them. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States had matured in size, confidence, and ambition. It had crossed mountains, seized territory, attracted immigrants, and expanded its economy. But beneath the surface, beneath the railways, newspapers, canals, and farms, a fault line widened. It was not a sudden fracture, it deepened slowly, year by year, as two visions of the nation grew increasingly incompatible. At the heart of the division lay slavery, an institution older than the republic itself, preserved through compromise, tolerated by necessity, and protected by law. In the South, slavery underpinned the economy. Cotton and tobacco plantations relied on enslaved labor, and prosperity for planters rested on the bodies and bondage of millions who had no legal personhood, no autonomy, and no future promised except labor. In the North, slavery gradually diminished, driven by industrialization, free labor ideology, and reform movements. Though racism existed there as well, the economic and moral debate took a different shape. The question was not merely whether slavery should continue, but whether the nation could expand westward without extending it. Expansion made that question unavoidable. Every new territory petitioning for statehood forced Congress to decide, slave or free? Each decision threatened to upset a delicate balance that had held the Union together. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were not solutions. They were temporary armistices between competing social worlds. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state, strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, and sought to calm sectional tensions. But the Fugitive Slave Act provoked outrage in the North, requiring citizens to assist in capturing escaped individuals and punishing those who refused. Former slaves who had lived free for years found themselves hunted again. Abolitionists, once dismissed as radicals, gained wider support as the brutality of the law became visible to those previously shielded from it. In Kansas, the Kansas-Nebraska Act introduced the principle of popular sovereignty, allowing settlers to decide whether their territory would permit slavery. The result was not democracy but violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into the region, clashing in towns and fields. Homes burned, people died, and the territory became known as Bleeding Kansas. The conflict was local, but its meaning was national. Compromise could no longer contain the issue. As tensions escalated, voices grew louder on both sides. In the South, leaders defended slavery not merely as a necessity, but as a positive good, an argument that revealed how deeply the institution had become tied to identity and status. In the North, newspapers, lecturers, and abolitionists condemned slavery as incompatible with the nation's founding ideas. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin stirred empathy and fury in equal measure. Frederick Douglass, a former slave-turned-orator, writer, and advocate, challenged audiences to confront the hypocrisy of a nation that celebrated liberty while denying it to millions. Yet the argument was never purely moral or philosophical. Economics sharpened division. Southern wealth depended on cotton, and cotton depended on slavery. Northern factories depended on wage labor, industry, and immigration. Commerce tied the sections together, but ideology pulled them apart. The North looked toward progress, mechanization, and innovation. The South looked toward tradition, hierarchy, and agricultural stability. Each believed the other misunderstood not only its interests, but its very way of life. Politics attempted to mediate the divide, but politics is only as strong as the consensus it represents. And consensus was fading. The Whig Party collapsed, unable to reconcile its factions. New parties emerged, including the Republican Party, founded on opposition to the expansion of slavery. The Democratic Party fractured along sectional lines, no longer united in purpose. The center, always the most fragile place in politics, began to dissolve. Then came the Dred Scott decision of 1857, in which the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans, enslaved or free, could not be citizens and that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories. The decision invalidated compromise and inflamed the nation. To many in the South, it affirmed their rights. To many in the North, it was proof that the government had become an instrument of slavery rather than liberty. In 1859, John Brown, an abolitionist willing to embrace violence, led a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry. His aim was to spark a slave uprising. The uprising failed, Brown was captured and executed. To the South, he was a criminal and a warning. To the North, he became a martyr to a cause that was rapidly moving from moral debate to political destiny. The election of 1860 sealed the fate of compromise. Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who opposed the spread of slavery but promised not to interfere where it already existed, won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. For many in the South, Lincoln's victory was evidence that the nation no longer belonged to them, that their interests, culture, and future would be dictated by others. Secession began with South Carolina in December 1860, followed by a cascade of states forming the Confederate States of America. Secession was justified in terms of states' rights, sovereignty, and defense of liberty, yet its cornerstone, as Confederate leaders openly declared, was the preservation of slavery. The Union, confronted with dissolution, faced a moment of decision. A nation born from revolution now confronted disunion from within. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The bombardment lasted hours. No one could mistake its meaning. The conflict had moved beyond speeches and arguments. The Civil War had begun. War is often described in terms of battles and campaigns, but war reshapes societies long before the first shots. In the North, factories converted to military production, cities organized for recruitment, and newspapers reported events with urgency. In the South, the economy shifted toward survival, and men enlisted in numbers that stunned observers. Communities sent sons, brothers, and husbands to a war whose length and cost few imagined. The early years of the conflict revealed the advantage of the North in population, industry, and resources, yet the South fought with determination and skill, led by generals such as Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Battles unfolded across landscapes once settled by farms and towns. Antietam, Shiloh, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. Names that would become lodged in memory through loss and tragedy. At its core, the Civil War was about the future of the nation. Would the United States remain a single republic, or would it fracture into separate sovereignties? Would slavery persist as a defining institution, or would the ideals of the Declaration finally extend beyond rhetoric? In 1863, after the Battle of Gettysburg and the Siege of Vicksburg, momentum shifted. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states free. The war now carried a moral dimension visible to the world. Freedom, once postponed, became a principle worth defending on the battlefield. By 1865, after brutal campaigns that devastated the South, the Confederacy collapsed. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. Lincoln spoke of reconciliation rather than vengeance, of malice toward none, and charity for all. But days after victory, he was assassinated, leaving the nation to reckon with peace without his guidance. The Civil War ended slavery. It preserved the Union. But it left unanswered questions about citizenship, equality, and Reconstruction, questions that would shape the next century. Explores the difficult aftermath, Reconstruction, broken promises, new struggles for freedom, and the challenge of rebuilding a nation not only in law, but in spirit. The cannons fell silent in 1865, but silence did not bring clarity. The Civil War had preserved the Union and abolished slavery, yet victory created as many questions as it answered. A nation shattered by war now faced the task of rebuilding itself, not merely in roads, farms, and railways, but in laws, identity, and memory. Reconstruction would demand patience, imagination, and courage. It would also reveal how fragile progress can be, and how deeply a society must struggle to reshape its own foundations. The first challenge was immediate: what was the South now? Its economy lay in ruins. Plantations that once relied on enslaved labor lacked both workforce and capital. Cities such as Richmond, Atlanta, and Charleston bore scars of destruction. Railways were torn, farms neglected, and governments dissolved. The Confederate experiment had collapsed, leaving behind a landscape marked by loss and uncertainty. The second challenge was perhaps greater: who were the formerly enslaved now? Legally free, but lacking land, wealth, education, or protection, they confronted a future full of hope and danger. Freedom changes status, but it does not instantly change circumstance. Many searched for family members who had been sold away, traveling miles with only names and rumors as guides. Others sought employment, schooling, or simply a place to begin anew. President Abraham Lincoln had envisioned a Reconstruction grounded in reconciliation rather than retribution. But his assassination in April 1865 removed the very figure best suited to guide the transition. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, and with him, Reconstruction took a different course. Johnson, a Southerner loyal to the Union but hostile to the idea of racial equality, favored rapid restoration of Southern governments with limited federal requirements. Southern states obliged, but their laws, known as Black Codes, attempted to restrict the freedom of African Americans, limiting movement, employment, and civil rights. The war had ended slavery in law, but the struggle to define freedom in practice had only begun. Congress, led by a coalition of Republicans, rejected Johnson's leniency. Determined that the sacrifices of war not be squandered, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, affirming citizenship for African Americans. The 14th Amendment followed, guaranteeing equal protection under the law. These were radical transformations, amendments that changed the Constitution not merely in structure, but in spirit. During Reconstruction, federal troops remained in the South to enforce new laws and protect freed people. The Freedmen's Bureau provided assistance in food, labor contracts, and education. Schools opened where none had existed before, and literacy, denied by law during slavery, spread rapidly. Churches flourished as centers of community and resilience. African Americans held political office in local, state, and even national government. For a brief moment, the South glimpsed a different possible future, one in which democracy expanded rather than contracted. But transformations rarely proceed without resistance. Many white Southerners viewed Reconstruction not as rebuilding, but as occupation. Secret societies, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, used terror, intimidation, and violence to undermine black political participation and restore racial hierarchy. Night riders burned homes, lynched activists, and assaulted voters. Violence, rather than argument, became the weapon of opposition. Northern support for Reconstruction waned over time. The optimism that followed the war dimmed in the face of political fatigue, economic depression, and shifting priorities. Corruption scandals within the Grant administration tarnished the image of federal leadership, even as Grant himself remained committed to protecting freed people's rights. The Panic of 1873 diverted national attention toward financial crisis. By the mid-1870s, the North grew weary of Southern affairs, and political compromise once again took the place of principle. The election of 1876, one of the most contested in history, produced a resolution that would define the end of Reconstruction. Rutherford B. Hayes secured the presidency through an agreement promising the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. With their departure, so too departed the federal capacity to enforce civil rights. Southern states quickly enacted laws and policies to restrict black voting, segregate public spaces, and control labor. These measures solidified into a system known as Jim Crow, a racial order that would endure for generations. Yet history is not solely defined by retreat. In the decades that followed, African Americans built institutions, communities, and intellectual movements that challenged inequality. Figures such as Booker T. Washington argued for advancement through education and enterprise, while W.E.B. Du Bois insisted that civil rights and political power were essential for true equality. The struggle for justice became not an event, but a long campaign. Beyond the South, the nation transformed in other ways. Industrialization accelerated, drawing workers to cities and factories. Steel, railroads, coal, and oil reshaped the economy. The frontier continued to push westward, bringing settlers into conflict with indigenous nations who faced displacement, forced treaties, and warfare. The so-called closing of the frontier was not a romantic end, but a painful process of expansion that disrupted cultures older than the Republic itself. Immigration surged as millions arrived from Europe, seeking opportunity in a land that offered both promise and prejudice. Cities swelled with new languages, customs, and labor. Class tensions sharpened as workers organized for wages, hours, and safety. Strikes erupted, corporations rose, and government struggled to balance capital and labor. Meanwhile, America's role in the world began to change. No longer merely a republic on the Atlantic coast, it became a nation with economic reach and strategic interest. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a turning point, acquiring territories beyond the continent and signaling that the United States had stepped onto the global stage. As the 19th century closed and the 20th century dawned, the United States grappled with its own contradictions. It had abolished slavery but tolerated segregation. It celebrated democracy but restricted voting for women, immigrants, and minorities. It championed opportunity but allowed monopolies to dominate markets. It expanded industry while questioning the human cost of that expansion. Yet progress often emerges from tension. Reform movements rose in response to industrial inequality, seeking to protect workers, consumers, and children. Women demanded suffrage with renewed determination. Journalists exposed corruption, poverty, and corporate abuse. The progressive era reimagined the role of government and the meaning of citizenship. By the early 20th century, the United States had transformed from a fragile republic into a powerful nation, industrial, diverse, and influential. But transformation did not erase the past. The legacy of slavery, the memory of war, and the unfinished business of equality remained beneath the surface of public life. The Civil War had preserved the Union. Reconstruction had attempted to redefine it. The decades that followed revealed both the depth of America's ambition and the weight of its contradictions. The United States into the modern century, through war, reform, prosperity, depression, global conflict, and the ongoing struggle to fulfill the promises first written on parchment and proclaimed in revolution. As the 19th century yielded to the 20th, the United States faced a world in which progress and conflict advanced together. The nation had grown powerful in industry, population, and wealth. Railroads stitched the continent from coast to coast. Cities swelled. Telegraphs and telephones collapsed distance itself, and ideas traveled as quickly as goods. Yet progress is never evenly distributed, and prosperity is not always shared. The early decades of the new century brought reform. The progressive era sought to curb the excesses of industrial capitalism. Regulating food safety, breaking monopolies, and defending workers. Women demanded the right to vote, arguing that democracy could no longer justify a political system that excluded half its population. After decades of activism, marches, and persuasion, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, granting women suffrage. The victory symbolized not the end of struggle, but the expansion of citizenship. Immigration reshaped the nation's cultural landscape. Millions arrived from Italy, Poland, Russia, and across Europe, fleeing poverty, persecution, and war. They crowded into neighborhoods, learned new languages, and sought opportunity, while facing discrimination and suspicion. The United States became, more than ever before, a mosaic of cultures and identities, united not by ancestry but by the hope of belonging. Yet even as democracy expanded, inequality persisted. African Americans in the South lived under Jim Crow segregation, while those who migrated north in the Great Migration sought better wages and greater dignity in industrial cities. There, they confronted new forms of discrimination, but also built communities rich in culture, music, literature, and resilience. The Harlem Renaissance, though often celebrated for its artistic achievements, was also a declaration of presence, a refusal to remain unseen. Then, in 1914, Europe descended into war. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, it did so reluctantly, but its intervention shifted the balance of power. American soldiers fought in France, and American factories supplied the Allies. When the armistice came in 1918, the world looked different. Empires collapsed, borders shifted, and new ideologies stirred unrest. President Woodrow Wilson envisioned a League of Nations to secure peace, but the U.S. refused to join, turning inward as the decade unfolded. The 1920s are remembered as an era of prosperity and glamour, of jazz, radios, automobiles, and motion pictures. Consumers embraced new technologies, credit expanded, and advertising transformed desire into habit. But beneath the glitter, the economy rested on unstable foundations. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and the Great Depression began. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Families queued for bread. Millions found themselves without work, without security, and without answers. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed the presidency and launched the New Deal, a series of programs that reimagined the relationship between government and citizens. Public works projects employed the jobless. Social Security offered security to the elderly. Regulations restrained financial speculation. The New Deal did not end the Depression, but it reshaped the nation's expectations. Government, once seen as distant, became an instrument of economic protection. While America struggled, the world moved toward catastrophe. Authoritarian regimes rose in Germany, Italy, and Japan, driven by nationalism, militarism, and expansion. War erupted in Europe in 1939. The United States remained officially neutral, but neutrality narrowed as allies pleaded for assistance. When Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, neutrality shattered. The United States entered World War II. The war mobilized the nation on a scale without precedent. Factories converted to military production. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, challenging traditional assumptions about gender and labor. Soldiers fought across Europe and the Pacific. At home, rationing, victory gardens, and war bonds bound civilians to the national effort. Yet even in a war for democracy, contradictions of democracy remained. Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, stripped of property and freedom out of fear and prejudice. The war ended with the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945 and Imperial Japan shortly after. The United States emerged as a global superpower. Its economy, spared the destruction that ravaged Europe and Asia, stood strong. Yet victory ushered not peace, but a new kind of conflict, ideological, geopolitical, and existential. The Soviet Union, once a wartime ally, became the antagonist of the Cold War. Capitalism confronted communism. Democracy confronted authoritarianism. Nuclear weapons made conflict unthinkable and diplomacy essential. The world reorganized into spheres of influence, alliances, and intelligence networks. American troops fought in Korea, and decades later in Vietnam, conflicts whose outcomes were measured not only in territory, but in ideas and lives. At home, the contradiction between American ideals and American realities became increasingly impossible to ignore. The civil rights movement challenged segregation, disenfranchisement, and discrimination. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and countless unnamed activists risked their lives to demand equality. The nation watched protests, marches, sit-ins, and speeches. Television broadcast injustice into living rooms. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 marked legislative victories, but the struggle for dignity continued. A reminder that citizenship evolves not solely through law, but through persistence. Social movements expanded beyond race. Feminists demanded workplace equality and reproductive autonomy. LGBTQ+ communities challenged marginalization. Environmentalists warned of pollution and ecological damage, leading to new protections for air, water, and wildlife. American democracy proved capable of reinvention, but reinvention rarely comes without resistance. The late 20th century brought technological innovation. Computers shrank from room-sized machines to household devices. The Internet collapsed distance as profoundly as railroads once did. Globalization linked economies in ways unimaginable a century earlier. Trade agreements connected markets, outsourcing and automation reshaped labor. Wealth accumulated, but unevenly, and inequality widened once more. The Cold War ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The United States stood as the world's sole superpower. Yet victory did not produce certainty. The early 21st century brought terrorism, recession, cultural polarization, and debates over the meaning of American identity in a world both interconnected and divided. The attacks of September 11, 2001, transformed foreign policy, security, and public life. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq followed, complex and enduring. Throughout these decades, the United States wrestled with its own narrative. Was it a land of opportunity or inequality? A beacon of liberty or a nation burdened by unresolved history? An empire of influence or a republic of ideals? The answers depended on who one asked, and when. Reflecting on this journey requires returning to the beginning, to the forests, rivers, and nations that existed before colonization, to the revolution that proclaimed principles larger than its moment, to the Civil War that tested unity, to Reconstruction that attempted equality. To the struggles for rights that expanded the definition of "we the people." American history is not a straight line of progress, nor a simple tale of triumph. It is a story of ideals declared and ideals pursued, sometimes achieved and often deferred. The United States entered the 21st century powerful, admired, criticized, and influential. Its culture spread across the world through music, film, technology, and commerce. Its debates, about freedom, identity, and justice, echoed beyond its borders. Its contradictions remained visible: wealth beside poverty, innovation beside inequality, freedom beside exclusion, pride beside doubt. Yet perhaps the essence of the American story lies precisely in its contradictions. A nation founded on the belief that all people are created equal has spent centuries arguing over who counts as people, and what equality requires. A republic built on self-government has struggled to balance liberty and order. A society defined by immigration has wrestled with belonging. A country that proclaims opportunity has confronted the reality that opportunity is uneven. History does not offer closure. It offers understanding. And understanding, if taken seriously, invites reflection rather than certainty. The story of America is not finished, because no nation's story ever is. Every generation inherits a republic to maintain, revise, and reimagine, just as previous generations did before them. Whether the future fulfills the promises of the past remains an open question. But questions are what keep history alive. America did not begin as a nation. It began as land. It became a nation through revolution. It expanded through ambition, struggled through contradiction, fractured through civil war, rebuilt through resilience, and evolved through movements for justice. Its strength has never been in perfection, but in argument. The ongoing debate over what freedom, equality, and citizenship mean. If we look back across centuries, from the first footsteps across a frozen land bridge, to the crowded ships crossing the Atlantic, to the constitutional debates, the battlefields of Gettysburg, the marches of Selma, and the networks of the digital age, we see not a single story, but many stories woven together. Some triumphant, some tragic, all human. The United States remains an experiment. Not in geography or economy, but in principle. And experiments endure not because they succeed flawlessly, but because they continue. Thank you for listening to this story.